All right. I'm going to share my screen. I can't see the chat when I'm sharing, so just holler at me, Hannah, if somebody has a question they want to that they want to ask before then. So, okay, so we're just going to go ahead and launch into it. Like I said, we're going to be talking about supporting positive behavior at alternative schools. There we go. And really the focus today is thinking about what types of adaptations or intensifications we need to make to best practices when we are in these alternative settings. So just to kind of set the framework before we launch into everything, when I'm talking about alternative settings today, it's like I mentioned before, court schools or community day schools, or programs for students with emotional behavioral disorders, things like that. So when we're looking at best practices just on a comprehensive campus, we've got that kind of three-tiered structure in place, if you will, where 80% of the students generally get their needs met by the site-wide practices, and then maybe about 15% need a little bit of an extra boost of supports, whether it's for behavior or academics, and then maybe 5% or 10%, 5 to 7% need really, really intensified supports, either for academics or behavior. When we're talking about our programs, a lot of the times the alternative programs that we serve are getting those top tier, real intensive students. And sometimes that's making up almost all of our programs. So that being said, we are forced to look at intensified or adapted practices so that we can meet their needs. Typically, even though we have students with higher needs, it still distributes out kind of into a three-tiered system, if you will, where there's still most of the students get their needs met by our school-wide practices and systems. Some need extra supports and some still need really intensive supports. But that's just kind of like the three-tiered logic and model that we have there. I can see the little button that there's a couple things in chat. Are we good?
Yes, we are totally good. Yes.
Okay, perfect. So really, this is just acknowledging that not only are you all juggling everything that has to be juggled at a comprehensive site, but it's times 10 a little bit. So thinking about a lot of the main points that I want to discuss with you today and the core features of what we can either scale up or intensify, those things are hard to plan, and sometimes they're hard to stay on top of, and it takes a lot of effort. But just pointing out, as far as the rationale, that it's worth it, because obviously we know that there's a lot of negative situations that occur if we have weak or inefficient behavior support strategies. Has anyone ever felt like this guy? Probably. You can get into that phase where you feel like you're kind of chasing your tail, or you're just in reaction mode. So there's teacher burnout, there's learning loss, there's, if we don't have effective behavior support strategies and behavior management strategies, we see fractured relationships between staff and students. We all know that we need to have good, strong, positive relationships in order to effectively support our youth. So if we don't have these good types of strategies in place, that's going to impact those relationships as well. And we're not going to be able to promote psychological safety and physical safety and sense of belonging and all of that. So lots and lots, obviously, of undesired outcomes if we don't have these things in place. So even though it can be really hard to set them up, it's definitely worth it in the long run. Okay. So really, these are the 5 categories that we're going to talk about today. I got to keep an eye on the time here because I do want to leave some, opening up my clock, sorry. I want to leave some time for questions at the end. But these are the 5 main categories, and they're probably familiar to you guys. What I want to highlight is the kind of adaptations or additional considerations that I've found to be really helpful in working with, in supporting a variety of different alternative programs over the years. Okay, so first of all, talking about setting expectations, it's really about transparency and predictability. We know that for evidence-based practices, for trauma-informed practices, that this is a key feature, that it's going to help with students as far as their ability to focus or retain information, or just, if they're coming from kind of a trauma background, this is a really critical piece. So this is taking a lot of intentionality, and let's kind of talk about what that looks like to get your team developing or refining your behavior expectations. So when I'm working with teams to do this, either if they're developing their site-wide behavior expectations for the first time, or if they're just revising or refining them, really focus on getting team buy-in for everybody and thinking about, what hills are you willing to die on? So looking at, when everybody's coming together and saying, okay, this is what we expect in this context, or this is what we expect here, I'm always checking in and making sure that people are really willing to enforce the expectations. So are they willing to prompt those expectations, remind those expectations, follow through with those expectations? And if we don't have at least 80% of staff really committing, then I say, well, we really need to look at whether or not this is an expectation that we want to put on our list or not. If you have some staff enforcing expectations and others not, then you're completely going against that idea of consistency and transparency across staff. So you have to really carve out time and have those long conversations with the team to really define what behavior expectations are most meaningful for your site. Bringing in some ideas about growth mindset, I think, for expectations are good too. Thinking about how we can build in expectations to students about how they can learn from their mistakes, or can we have expectations around, are they allowed to revise errors and resubmit work? Or do you have an expectation around the power of yet? So maybe you'll have a site-wide expectation that, you don't say like, I don't know, you might say, I don't know yet, or I can't do that. Instead of I can't do that, I can't do that yet. So thinking about, do you want to put some elements like that that will teach and promote other skills in the students as well? In alternative settings, thinking about new pro-social habits for students is also something for your team to think about embedding into your expectations. So a lot of the times in our programs, the alternative programs that we serve, students are there because they've had the opposite of pro-social habits, right? They may have gotten expelled or had a lot of disciplinary actions because of challenging behaviors. So we try to embed in our expectations, what's the opposite of those challenging behaviors? So if a lot of the students have gotten in trouble or struggled with arguing with teachers and being defiant towards teachers, for example, maybe embedded in your expectations is, how do you advocate for yourself? What does that look like specifically in a way that's appropriate, but you're still able to have a voice and get your needs met? Or maybe in your expectations, you have things along the lines of, how do you self-regulate? How do you take a break? What coping skills do you use? So thinking about, when you're doing all of this planning, behavior expectations shouldn't just be things that meet the teacher's needs. It's what meets the students' needs as well, because that's when you're really going to see that, that synergy and buy-in and growth as well. And then another just tip about this, when you're thinking about your site-wide expectations, thinking about, what are your site values? So what are you really trying to ingrain as a theme in everything? Do you have site values about mutual trust and respect with students and staff, for example? And if so, maybe you put behavior expectations for staff in your expectations matrix too. You say, this is what we expect of students, and students, this is what you can expect of us. Or if a big value of your program is about communicating high academic expectations for achievement for your students, do your behavior expectations also reflect that? So thinking big picture, what are your overarching values? And then when you're breaking down those real specifics, what does that look like too?
And I had a question come in as a direct message to me that follows up on that, aligning expectations with site values. What is the role of bringing in students and parents and other community members into that process?
I'm so glad that question came up. That's a huge recommendation when we're talking about buy-in and hills but basically buy-in too, and formulating that is getting the student input. and thinking about what's the student culture, what's the community and family culture, and asking the students for their ideas. In my experience, when I've done this with teams at our programs, a lot of the times the students are harder. They have like stricter expectations than the staff would have. And so sometimes we'll see, for example, there's a problem in our data, like students doing something strange with hats or beanies or something like that. And so we have the students sit down and outline what all the expectations are. Or if we're drafting up the expectations, we'll pull in student leadership, or just any students, and get their feedback on that as well. So that's a huge part, is about getting student buy-in, and then also having systems in place to get family input too, whether that's surveys or whether that's monthly school site council meetings, or inviting parents to PBIS meetings if you have something like that. So that's a huge piece of that as well, is making sure that your behavior expectations reflect the values of your site, but also reflect the impact or the input of the students. Thank you for bringing that up. That's a good point.
Yeah. And one other question we got related to this essential practice, number one, of defining behavior expectations, is you mentioned earlier getting 80% buy-in. How do you measure that buy-in? Someone wants to know.
Good question. Usually when you're having the group conversations, you can tell. I mean, there might be one or two holdouts staff, sometimes that happens. Sometimes what I'll do is I'll vote. So I'll do either thumbs up, thumbs middle, thumbs down. So, I love it, I can live with it, or I hate it, is thumbs up, thumbs middle, thumbs down, and just doing a visual and getting an idea from that. And being super clear, okay, can you guys commit to really buying into this expectation? Another way that we've done it in the past is colored sticker dots, and you just post the written document that you've drafted and have people put either red, green, or yellow, by different expectations, if they like them or don't like them. And so that you can tell then if there's a bunch of yellow and red dots on one of the expectations, that will quickly tell you, oh, we don't have at least 80% buy-in on this. We need to come back and revisit this and work it out. And every team works things out differently. So good question.
Awesome. Thank you.
Great. Okay. So generally speaking, and all of this is all mashed together. So we talk about really defining very, very specific behavior expectations so that we can have that transparency. And now we got to talk about how to teach them. I like this quote here. The mediocre teacher tells, the good teacher explains, the superior teacher demonstrates, and the great teacher inspires. Because it also, this is good teaching practice, but it also relates to how we need to teach the expectations. Sometimes we might get so busy that we have these expectations and the behavior expectations, and we just give them to a student in a handbook, and or we tell them once and then, expect them to kind of remember it forever. And so thinking about how can we step up our instructional game when it comes to behavior expectations so that it really breathes life into them, and it makes them in the forefront of everybody's minds. And there's a zillion different ways that people can creatively teach the expectations. But it needs to be kind of a living, breathing thing. So some tips for that when we're teaching expectations to students and introducing it to them is making sure we're giving them the rationale of what we want them to do. So really, what is in it for them? How is it going to benefit them if they follow XYZ expectations? It's going to teach them job or skills potentially for employment later. It might, for some of our kids, it might help them clear their expulsion and return back to their community school, or, whatever the context of your program is, but making sure that they know what's in it for them. And in a lot of our sites, we talk about code switching with our students and talk about time and place, context. So here at school, it's kind of like your job. And so we are trying to follow these expectations here, but in the community or with your family or friends, you might get your needs met differently. And so honoring still, whether it's part of their culture or just honoring that that's part of being a kid, that they may still save this one set of behaviors for this context and a different set of behaviors for another. I think that's a really helpful part of the conversation when we're teaching them behavior expectations. And when we're responding to when expectations aren't met as well, we kind of have that theme. So I've got a principal that one of the principals, she's hilarious. But if a student shows up to school in like a not appropriate for school dress, the principal might say, "You look gorgeous. Oh my gosh, I love that. And that dress would be so great out at a club." At school, let's see what we might have that would be more appropriate for the classroom. So teaching that distinction of time and place context as part of teaching the expectations as well. Pre-corrections is a term for a really strong evidence-based practice that's really simple. These are all things that should be simple for you guys to do. So we know a lot of the times when students are going to struggle with meeting certain behavior expectations, just give them a reminder ahead of time. So refer to whatever your written expectations document is, pre-correct so that they don't have a chance to make the error. And then it gives you that opportunity to give them acknowledgement about that as well. So that's another way to breathe life into your expectations and routines and teach them ongoing. And as I mentioned before, you may want to include behavior expectations for staff. So it's that way of honoring the students and saying, here's what you can expect of us as well. And then, it's kind of like a, excuse me, a bi-directional agreement there of this is how we're all agreeing to operate as a group. How are we doing with questions before we move on to the next one?
There aren't any questions on this so far. I just checked the Q&A too, but please drop them in the chat if you think of any.
Okay, so I'm going to move on to consistent responses to challenging behaviors. So this one, I can never really, it looks like, is that from the 1800s? I don't know if you guys have seen this before, but some of the examples of problem behavior here are kind of funny. But the point here is we need to have some sort of agreed system or practices like this, where we have very specifically defined what challenging behaviors might come up, and then what is our response going to be for each one of those different challenging behaviors. So you can see here, we're obviously not using lashes, but they have a progressive discipline response, basically based off of the severity of the problem behaviors. So I don't know if any of you guys are having kids going and playing about the mill or creek, but you'll have to come up with a response to that if you do. So, okay, so some tips about this piece. So we already have our expectations. This is for when unexpected behaviors occur or students aren't following the expectations. Same thing here. The key is consistency and transparency across behaviors and students. One of the big things that schools all across the nation will find is if they don't have a progressive discipline chart or something like that, if they don't have a system for responding consistently, you'll start seeing disproportionate outcomes across your students. So just the data shows that you'll see some marginalized student groups getting higher rates of discipline or or lower rates of certain opportunities, things like that. So that is one huge outcome if we don't have this in place. And then also, if we don't have this in place, you'll see differential responses from students as well. Well, so-and-so lets me get away with this, and you're getting me in trouble for this. And if it's not consistent, then you don't have that predictable environment. So again, it's kind of the same process as coming up with your expectation. The team getting together and saying, what are the minor and major behaviors that we need to respond to? How are we going to respond to them? And how are we going to get close to responding to them kind of the same way every time? And embedding into that, taking a look at function-based responses. So, for example, if students are engaging in behaviors at school in order to get out of school, well, then maybe the consequence for that needs to be something where they're not allowed to get out of school. We don't want the disciplinary response to necessarily reinforce the problem behavior. And looking at other means of correction too. Are there things that they can do? Can they have a restorative conversation? Can they participate in a facilitated conflict resolution or some social emotional learning modules instead of suspension or detention or something like that? So really embedding into that as much as you can, what are non-exclusionary practices? Because we don't want to, a lot of our students have already heard the message for a long time that we don't want you, or you don't belong here. And so we don't want to continue perpetuating that message whenever we can. whenever we can avoid it. There's obviously times when exclusionary practices are necessary, but just thinking about that, how can we embed some of those in there? And with your progressive discipline matrix, or whatever you want to call it, your disciplinary responses, change them if they aren't working. Like really, this for our programs, this is a fluid document. If we have a set of responses for problem behavior, and then we're measuring that problem behavior and it's not getting any better, that tells us that that consequence isn't working. And so the team gets together to say, okay, do we need to respond differently when students engage in this? And that could be for a variety of reasons. Either it's not meaningful enough of a consequence, or maybe staff aren't implementing it consistently. But it's about having that conversation about why isn't it working and what can we do to change it? So again, this is all real just kind of overview information, but as far as this practice, it's all kind of tied in there.
Yeah. And a question that just came in then is, like you mentioned, the team to review it. So who really is a part of this team then? Because teachers sometimes do this just within their own classroom, but you're talking much more about a school-wide program. So what does this team really look like? Someone's wondering.
For our programs, it's if the program is really small, it'll be the entire team. And we meet monthly to look at data and look at these practices and work on this together. For other programs that are a little bit bigger, there's a selection of team members that include somebody with behavioral expertise, like a behavior specialist, somebody from the special ed department, the administrator, some gen ed teacher representatives, classified staff, so it'll be a core team that comes together with some real set systems for doing that. And every program, because we're all so unique, every program would need to figure out who the best people are to do that. But and I can send, if anybody wants to shoot me an email too, I can send other resources about that, like the frequency of meeting and the kind of structures and the things that you look at during those meetings as well.
Thank you.
Cool. All right. So we're going to move into talking about student acknowledgement, but I want to just get out of the way first. The question that comes up sometimes about bribery versus positive reinforcement. They are not the same thing. And really just pointing out the difference being, it is bribery if the student's already doing something bad and you're saying, I'll give you XYZ thing that you like if you stop. It's the difference of who's in control. Is the child in control in that situation? Or when we're doing positive reinforcement, we're thinking ahead of time, real strategically about what we want to reinforce, what we want to have increase. And we're delivering that contingent upon those behaviors. So thinking about, if you're in a cycle of bribery to get the student to stop doing something, then you're actually going to start seeing that behavior more and more in the future, and instead shifting it to the intentional positive reinforcement strategy. So some tips about that. I'm sure a lot of you guys have heard that, generally speaking, we want to have at least a 4-to-1 ratio of positive to corrective interactions. And that doesn't have to be like, good job, good job, good job, good job. Do that differently. When we say positive to corrective, it could be reinforcing, it could be relationship building, it could just be connections. But generally speaking, at your comprehensive campuses, this is your what you want to kind of hit. There are a lot of folks who would say that for emotionally and behaviorally disturbed youth or trauma impacted youth, that might get closer to 10-to-1 or 12-to-1. So again, thinking about our alternative settings, sometimes we really have to intensify things a little bit. So one great thing about live school, one of the many great things about live school, obviously, is you can track that sometimes, if you're using corrective tracking in there as well. But just having live school be just such an easy system to use, it can increase the frequency of positive interactions from staff. Another key piece of any acknowledgement system is that it has to be specific and it has to be immediate. If you have to tell the student exactly what it is that you like that they're doing, so that they know, oh yeah, I need to do this. This is what I need to do more in the future to do it. So not just saying good job, but just saying, hey, I really like how you came up and approached me with your concern, rather than, doing it out loud in the middle of class or something like that. And then immediacy is also the key. The more immediate that a student receives positive reinforcement for something, the more likely it is that they're going to do that behavior more in the future. So if I wait and tell a student 2 days later that I liked something that they did, the connection is really weak there. And it's a lot less likely that they're going to be doing that more in the future. So catch them being good in the moment, tell them super specifically. Variety of modalities. So it could be certificates, it could be vocal, it could be vocal reinforcement, it could be points, it could be that they're earning an incentive. So thinking about all the ways that would be valuable to your students, having a variety of different ways that they can get acknowledged. It could be a shout out board for them or public acknowledgement about something. And then real extreme intentionality across staff. So see this theme I'm talking about, that it's all about planning and getting kind of group agreements from what the team is trying to foster in the student body. Talking about extreme intentionality relates to this next bullet point too, of selecting targets for reinforcement based off of challenging areas. So we talked about setting expectations for teaching pro-social skills. For example, if we know, gosh, most of our student body really needs to improve their coping skills or something like that, we may have intentionality around reinforcing anytime we see a student using a coping skill or a student accepting a prompt to use a coping skill. Or if we're, any kind of behavioral challenge that we're seeing, shouting out in class, for example. All right, so probably we want to have a strategy to reinforce people quietly raising their hand or whatever your signal is. So that's one of the reasons we're talking about all these areas, is they all really kind of mishmash together there. I'm going to show an example really quick. I just did screenshots of a bunch of our different live school point categories. So because these are just examples across our court school and juvenile hall, our community school, our independent study hybrid program, all of that. But looking at these, you can see, so even on the far right-hand side, there's one that says no energy to negative behavior. And then there's one that says keep calm and carry on, or MYOB, mind your own business. Those are basically the same behavior. Those are buttons from two separate programs that staff will use to reinforce students. The wording's just different because it reflects how they talk to their staff or their students. It reflects the culture of the school. And another thing that I love about this is that it provides the prompt to the teacher about the specificity of the feedback that they can give. So at our community school site, they might say, Jimmy, I'm giving you a point right now for not giving any energy to negative behavior. And what that means, obviously, is if another student is struggling with their behavior and other kids are not jumping in and they're ignoring it, then you might reinforce that in the moment if that's been a big problem. Whereas, juvenile hall, it's like, okay, I'm giving you a point for MYOB. That's just the phrase that they came up with the kids, of keep calm, carry on, or MYOB. So what we really like to do is have a blend of academic. Some of our schools might have 30 different categories of points that they can give, and some start a lot smaller than that. I always recommend starting small, so because you're building up a habit with the staff as well. But building in both pro-social skills and academic skills, and things, really reinforcing things intentionally that are the opposite of the problem behavior that folks are having. Any questions before I move on to token economies? I'm trying to keep an eye on.
No, I think we're good. Yeah, let's keep going.
Cool. So talking about, technically, if you're setting up a school store with points like this, it's technically a token economy. Just some highlights here. Sometimes it doesn't even necessarily completely matter what you have in your school store, as long as they have a lot of choice. Forcing students to kind of get in their frontal lobe and make an evaluative choice between what they can buy, sometimes that's just the reinforcer. So keep that in mind. Choice is a real powerful thing. In our programs, serving alternative programs, we have to really intentionally look at how frequently they're going to be able to shop at the school store. So at our community school site, for example, because behavioral challenges are higher, they let the students purchase daily from the school store. At our K-8 hybrid independent study site, they can purchase 1 to 2 times a month, at juvenile hall, they can purchase once a week. So it just depends on the need and the structure, but be really intentional about why you're setting the schedule that you're setting, and make sure that it's frequent enough that they can purchase items so that it's valuable enough for them. If it's way too long delayed, then the points become, maybe less valuable than they would have before. This relates back to the key features of effective reinforcement. Your school store will not be effective at all if the students don't know what they're getting reinforced for or what they're getting points for. So I've seen situations where their school store doesn't work at all because the teachers are not really talking to the students during the day about what they're reinforcing them for. They just go in at the end of the day and they just add points, blah, 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 blah. The kid doesn't know that they got points. They don't know what they're getting reinforced for. So that then the students just think that they have this kind of bank account that keeps getting filled up with points that they can purchase stuff with. And that's not effective. So you definitely have to have the immediacy and specificity of point delivery. And just to address, because we're talking about alternative programs, a lot of alternatives programs run level systems, which can be both kind of a reinforcement and a punishment system. I just want to shout out that you can have like a live school system and a school store coexisting in harmony with a level system, and they can still kind of maintain their own separate entities there. So that they sometimes there's been thoughts that that's not the case. All right, so hold on a second here. I'm looking at our time. Can I talk just a couple more seconds here about a couple more minutes about some data, and then we'll open it up for questions?
Absolutely.
All right. I would probably lose my board certification if I didn't say that data is your superpower. I am definitely a data geek. I mean, for us, it really does inform everything that we do. And it's critical, in my opinion, and in the programs that I support, that we have systems in place to regularly review data. So, for example, we have a school-wide PBIS team that looks at school-wide data monthly and makes action plans around it. Then we also have a separate intervention team that meets every other week that's looking at individual student data, analyzing that and making decisions around that. Basically, in my opinion, if we're not measuring something and analyzing the data from it, we shouldn't even be doing it. I'm pretty hardcore about that, but I'll give you some examples of how it can be really beneficial. Because really we can't, if we're making changes without looking at data and seeing if it's moving things in the direction that we want, we don't know if it's working, we don't know what's working, so on and so forth. So when I'm talking about data sources, I kind of refer to this as sort of a three-legged stool, using all of these at once. Outcome data are things like behavior referrals or safety violations. We can look at pro-social behaviors too. So I look at live school data and look at how often students are getting reinforced and what they're getting reinforced for, either on an individual level or program-wide. Look at data disaggregated by student group. So do we have, are we seeing differential patterns in marginalized student groups or underserved student groups, things like that. So we've got our outcome data, we've got fidelity data. So how well are our staff implementing the things that we've all agreed on? If that's where the problem lies, is that we're not doing it consistently, then we know what our action plan is, versus if it's something, if we have to make an action plan that addresses issues with students. And then survey data. I rely on survey data a lot. We need to know if what we're doing is valid for our students and our families and our community partners. And so that might be surveys about school safety or school climate, or input about what do you want in your school store? What do you think this expectation should be? Sometimes I take the survey data and go back to the students and I say, wow, look at how much this dropped compared to last year. Let's do a data walk and kind of look at this data and come up with suggestions about how we could boost your confidence in these areas of school climate or something. So all of these really kind of fit together, and it will help inform our action planning around those things. I want to show you just a couple of examples of this. So this was just a screenshot of part of a school climate survey at our program in our court school in juvenile hall. And I wanted to see, before we launched live school there, and then after we launched live school there, what if that impacted our school climate data. So you can see that one with a green box around it. Before we launched live school there, sorry, I should explain the scale. It goes from strongly disagree to strongly agree. And so I'm usually looking for about I'm looking for about 3 or higher, because that means the majority of students are saying they either somewhat agree or strongly agree with the statements. So we were below 3, and then we launched live school there, and you can see that that jumped up, and I was really happy. If that data hadn't changed, or if it had gotten worse, that would have let me know that I need to go and change how we're using our points, how we're, what we're reinforcing, how we're reinforcing, and what the school store situation is like. And then last example of data, this combines disaggregated data for student groups with behavior referrals and positive acknowledgements. And this was from one of our community schools a while ago. What I saw in our behavior data was that 75 Latino students were 75% of the students who had the highest number of behavior referrals. So I wanted to see, well, okay, how often are those same kids getting positive acknowledgements? So looking at our live school data, this really was eye-opening for us, because they only accounted for 8% of the group of the students receiving the most positive acknowledgements. So when we look at the data to come up with an action plan, this was very clear that we could have this conversation with the staff of, okay, well, this group of students is getting a lot more behavior referrals, but they're also really not getting a lot of recognition compared to other students. Why is that? And what can we do about it? So I could talk about data till I'm blue in the face, but I know we're running out of time. But I just wanted to give you some of those examples of how we can look at different types of data and include looking at reinforcement data and survey data around that too. I'm going to open it up to questions here, but I just wanted to give a shout out to some of these other evidence-based practices that you can also really leverage even more in alternative settings. Increasing your opportunities to respond for students so that they can have several different opportunities a minute to either respond vocally or non-verbally, or in writing or something like that. So think about that's another strategy you can use. Positive greetings at the door sounds like the simplest thing in the world, and it is, but the data shows that it just by seeing a kid and making them feel seen and using their name, that it can substantially reduce behavior issues in class and can substantially increase academic engagement. Behavioral momentum, so using a strategy of doing quick, easy things right off the bat so that they can have successful responding, and you can reinforce those before moving into something a little bit more difficult. That's another great evidence-based strategy. And then more start requests instead of stop requests. Again, a simple thing to do, just a little bit of a mindset shift, but you can get a lot of bang for your buck from that as well. Okay, so that is it. I know we are just about out of time and wanted to open it up for some other questions.
Yeah, no, we got a few questions in. So let me pull them up, and then anyone else who has questions, drop them in the chat. We'll try to get through as many as we can in the last couple of minutes. But someone was wondering, so they appreciated that example you showed of the data of who was getting behavior referrals. They're wondering, how do you set reasonable goals coming out of that for growth and improvement? And that goes with some of that other data you were showing too, like you want to set goals for your program. So what advice would you give for that?
A great question. When we get together as we implement PBIS, but if you have an MTSS team or whatever, when we look at our data monthly, we look at all the different behaviors that we're concerned with school-wide, and we pick one. And we say, okay, here's the behavior. So we really define it. We might say, we've got a group of 7th through 9th graders at lunch that are engaging in roughhousing, whatever it might be. And so we then make an action plan around that. So are we going to reinforce something more? Are we going to teach something? Are we going to do prevention steps? Are we going to change what our consequences are? Whatever. Make an action plan. And then we look at our baseline data for that specific behavior. And then we set a goal. We agree upon a goal. So we might say, okay, we're going to implement this action plan. We're going to come back in 4 weeks. We want to see at least a 50% reduction in behavior referrals related to this. There's not a right or wrong. We might look ahead and be like, oh gosh, it's also spring is happening and we're going to be getting a bunch more girls, maybe we'll shoot for a 30% reduction, or something along those lines. But just so that you have a SMART goal that's related to your baseline, that you can measure after you've done your action plan. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. If you don't see any reduction, you say, well, let's look at our action plan. We probably didn't choose the right action. Let's keep working on it.
Awesome. And then the last question I have, since we're at time, is you were talking about your school store. What's the favorite reward of students at the store?
It depends on the store. The cup of noodles with tapatio is a big one. Yeah, what Takis and spicy chips are a big one, but you, depending on your program, you have to get approval for that. The nurse at our juvenile hall says, no, that's not good for tummies. Um, Canned mangoes is a big one sometimes. It really depends. So yeah. Yeah, water bottles.
Love it. I mean, we're all food motivated at the end of
Yes.
the day. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Kim, for this amazing presentation. I learned so much, and I'm just so grateful for your time. And so to everyone on the call, we'll be sending the slides and the recording later today. So thank you all.
And feel free to reach out if there's ever any questions. I'm happy to send other resources. I know this was just kind of, on the surface of everything. So feel free. Thank you for
Awesome. Well, thank
attending.
you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your day.